If you came of age in the 1970s, you remember the music that defined a generation. The Beatles had changed everything in the 60s. Elvis had started it all in the 50s, but in the 70s, a new sound emerged from a small island in the Caribbean, reggae. And the name synonymous with that sound was Bob Marley. Perhaps you first heard No Woman, No Cry on the radio driving home from work. Or maybe you saw him perform on television, those iconic dreadlocks swaying as he sang about peace and love. Maybe your children played his albums, and you wondered what all the fuss was about. Today, more than 4 decades after his passing, we're going to tell you the complete story of Robert Nesta Marley. Not the legend, not the icon, but the man. This is Bob Marley, the true story. His story begins not in fame and fortune, but in poverty, in a tiny village in the Jamaican mountains, where a mixed-race boy would face challenges that would shape not just his music, but his entire worldview. Welcome to 9 Mile, Jamaica. The year is 1945. The world has just emerged from the most devastating war in human history. And in this remote corner of the British Empire, a child is about to be born who would one day unite millions with 3 chords and a message. To understand Bob Marley, we must first understand Jamaica in the 1940s. The island was still a British colony. It wouldn't gain independence until 1962. For the descendants of enslaved Africans who made up the majority of the population, life was difficult. Poverty was widespread. Opportunities were few into this world. On February 6, 1945, Cedella Booker gave birth to her son, Robert Nesta Marley. Cedella was just 18 years old. The father, Norval Sinclair Marley, was a 50-year-old white British naval officer. It was an unusual relationship, and one that would leave young Bob caught between 2 worlds. Norval rarely visited. When he did, he brought money, but not affection. By the time Bob was a young boy, his father had essentially abandoned them. Bob would spend the rest of his life grappling with this absence, searching for identity, for belonging. 9 Mile was rural, isolated. No electricity, no running water. Cedella worked hard to provide for her son and her large extended family. Bob was one of many children in the household, but his mother saw something special in him. He sang, always sang. Even as a small child, Bob would make instruments out of whatever he could find. Tin cans became drums, sticks became guitars. Music was in his blood. His neighbors remember him as a quiet boy, thoughtful, observant. But when he sang, he transformed his voice. Even as a child, had a quality that made people stop and listen. In 1957, when Bob was 12 years old, Cedella made a decision that would change everything. They would leave 9 Mile. They would move to the capital, Kingston, seeking better opportunities. They settled in a neighborhood called Trenchtown. If you've heard Bob Marley's music, you've heard him sing about Trenchtown. It was one of Kingston's poorest areas, a government housing project where thousands lived in cramped conditions. Violence was common. Gangs controlled the streets. But Trenchtown had something else. Music. This was the late 1950s, early 1960s. Rock and roll was sweeping America. The Beatles would soon conquer the world. And in Jamaica, a new sound was being born in places like Trenchtown. Ska, a fusion of American rhythm and blues with Caribbean rhythms, fast, upbeat, danceable. young Bob Marley absorbed it all. He met other young musicians, Neville Livingston, who would later be known as Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh, whose birth name was Winston Hubert McIntosh. Together, they began harmonizing, practicing, dreaming of making music their lives. In 1962, at age 16, Bob recorded his first single. The song was called Judge Not. It didn't become a hit. Most people never heard it, but it was a beginning. The following year, Bob, Bunny, and Peter formed a group. They called themselves the Wailers. This was 1963. President Kennedy would be assassinated that November. The civil rights movement was reaching its peak in America. The world was changing, and young people were demanding change through music, through art, through action. The Wailers started recording with local producers in Kingston. Their early songs were score numbers, upbeat and energetic. But Bob was beginning to develop something else, something slower, heavier, more spiritual. He was beginning to find reggae. Let's set the scene. It's 1966. The Vietnam War is escalating. The Beatles have just released Revolver. Bob Dylan has gone electric. Jamaica has recently gained independence from Britain, and there's a feeling of possibility, of new beginnings. On February 10th, 1966, Bob Marley married Rita Anderson. She was a singer with a beautiful voice, and she would become not just his wife, but his musical partner and spiritual companion for the rest of his life. The day after the wedding, Bob left for the United States. His mother had moved to Delaware, and Bob went to join her to work and save money. For 8 months, he worked on an assembly line at a Chrysler plant. The work was mind-numbing. He hated it. But he saved his money, and more importantly, he realized something. America wasn't for him. His place was in Jamaica, making music. When Bob returned to Jamaica in late 1966, something had changed in him. He had begun exploring Rastafari, a spiritual movement that had emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s. Rastafari taught that Haile Selassie I, the Emperor of Ethiopia, was divine. It emphasized African identity, rejected Western materialism, and advocated the ritual use of cannabis as a sacrament. For Bob, Rastafari answered questions he'd been asking his whole life. Questions about identity, about his place in the world, about justice and righteousness. His music began to reflect these new convictions. The Wailers' songs became more conscious, more political, more spiritual. But success didn't come easily. For years, the Wailers struggled. They made records that sold modestly in Jamaica, but nowhere else. They were poor, sometimes hungry. Then, in 1972, everything changed. A British record producer named Chris Blackwell signed the Wailers to his label, Island Records. Blackwell had a vision to bring reggae to the world and to make Bob Marley the face of that movement. In 1973, the Wailers released their first international album, Catch a Fire. If you were listening to album-oriented rock radio in 1973, you might have heard it. The album didn't sell millions, but it received rave reviews. Music critics called it revolutionary, a new sound unlike anything else. The follow-up album, Burnin', came later in 1973. It included 2 songs that would become anthems, Get Up, Stand Up, and a song called I Shot the Sheriff. Now, if you remember 1974, you might recall that Eric Clapton released a version of I Shot the Sheriff that went to #1 in America. Suddenly, People who had never heard of Bob Marley were asking, who wrote this song? Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer left the group in 1974. There were creative differences, and both felt overshadowed by Bob's growing fame. Bob continued as Bob Marley and the Wailers, with Rita and two other female vocalists, the I3s, providing harmonies. From 1975 to 1980, Bob Marley released a series of albums that would define reggae music: Natty Dread, Rastaman Vibration, Exodus, Kaya, Survival, and Uprising. If you listened to FM radio in the late 70s, you heard these songs: No Woman, No Cry, Jamming, One Love, Three Little Birds. But Bob's music was about more than just melodies. Jamaica in the 1970s was experiencing severe political violence. Two parties, the Socialist People's National Party and the conservative Jamaica Labour Party, were essentially at war. Bob tried to stay above the fray. He preached unity, love, peace. In December 1976, he agreed to perform at a free concert called Smile Jamaica, intended to ease tensions before an election. 2 days before the concert, gunmen burst into Bob's home and opened fire. Bob was shot in the chest and arm. Rita was shot in the head. Their manager took 5 bullets. Miraculously, they all survived. And 2 days later, despite his injuries, Bob went on stage and performed. When asked why he would risk his life, he said something you might remember: "The people who are trying to make this world worse are not taking a day off. How can I?" Now we come to the part of the story that many people don't know or don't fully understand. In 1977, Bob Marley was at the height of his fame. He was 32 years old. He was touring the world, filling stadiums. His music was on the radio. He had achieved what he'd dreamed of as a boy in Trenchtown. But something was wrong. Bob loved football, what Americans call soccer. He played whenever he could, usually barefoot, with friends in Kingston. During one of these games, he injured his toe, the big toe on his right foot. It seemed like nothing, just a typical sports injury. But the toe didn't heal properly. Months passed, and there was a dark spot under the toenail. Bob, busy with tours and recording, didn't think much of it. Finally, in 1978, at Rita's insistence, he saw a doctor. The diagnosis was devastating: acral lentiginous melanoma. For those unfamiliar, this is a rare and aggressive form of skin cancer that most commonly affects people with darker skin. It often appears under the nails or on the palms or soles of the feet. The doctor explained the situation clearly. "Mr. Marley, we need to amputate your toe. If we don't, the cancer will spread and it will kill you." Let me pause here and explain the medical reality, because it's important to understand what Bob faced. In 1978, melanoma treatment was less advanced than today. But even then, if caught early and treated aggressively, survival rates were good. Amputation of the affected toe would likely have saved his life. But Bob Marley said no. To understand why, we need to understand Rastafari beliefs. In the Rastafarian faith, the human body is viewed as sacred, as a temple created by God, or, as Rastafarians say, Jah. The body should remain whole. Cutting any part of the body is seen as a violation of this sacred wholeness. For Bob, this wasn't just a religious rule. This was fundamental to who he was, to his identity. Rita pleaded with him. His mother begged him. Friends tried to convince him. But Bob was unwavering. "This body is not mine," he told Rita. "It belongs to Jah. I cannot desecrate it." Eventually a compromise was reached. The doctors performed a less invasive surgery, removing the nail bed and the visible cancerous tissue, but leaving the toe intact. Bob believed this would be enough. He wanted to believe it would be enough. For a while, it seemed to be. Bob continued touring, recording, performing to the world. He appeared healthy, vibrant, tireless. But inside his body, cancer cells were multiplying, spreading. From 1978 to 1980, Bob Marley maintained a grueling schedule. He toured Europe, America, Africa. He recorded 2 more albums. He performed in Zimbabwe at their independence celebration in 1980, an emotional high point of his career. But those close to him noticed changes. He was losing weight. He tired more easily. He complained of headaches. Bob attributed it to exhaustion, to the demands of touring. But the truth was far more serious. By 1980, the cancer had metastasized, spread to his lungs, liver, and brain. In September 1980, Bob collapsed while jogging in Central Park in New York City. He was rushed to the hospital. This time, the diagnosis couldn't be ignored. The cancer was throughout his body. It was terminal. The doctors told him he had months, perhaps a year, to live. Imagine being 35 years old, at the peak of your career, with children to raise, music still to make, and receiving that news. Bob didn't give up. He sought alternative treatments. He went to Germany, to a clinic run by Dr. Joseph Issels, who promised to treat cancer without conventional chemotherapy. For months, Bob underwent experimental treatments, special diets, injections, therapies that mainstream medicine didn't accept. Rita and the children visited when they could. Bob's famous dreadlocks fell out from the treatments. Physically, he was deteriorating, but spiritually, those who visited said he remained strong, still believing that Yah would provide a way. By May 1981, it was clear that the treatments weren't working. Bob made the decision to go home, to Jamaica, to die in the land he loved, surrounded by family. But his body was too weak. During the flight from Germany, his condition worsened critically. The plane made an emergency landing in Miami, Florida. Bob was taken to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital, the same hospital where, today, a plaque commemorates his final hours. On May 11th, 1981, at 11:45 in the morning, Bob Marley passed away. He was 36 years old. His final words, spoken to his son Ziggy, were these: "Money can't buy life." Think about that for a moment. A man who had achieved fame and fortune, whose music had touched millions, reduced it all to that simple truth in his final moments. Money can't buy life. The news spread quickly. Radio stations around the world interrupted their programming to announce that Bob Marley had died. If you were listening to the radio that day in May 1981, you might remember where you were when you heard the news. His body was flown back to Jamaica for a state funeral. More than 100,000 people lined the streets of Kingston to pay their respects. He was buried in 9 Mile, the village where he was born, in a mausoleum that stands there today. Now, more than 40 years later, people still ask, was Bob Marley's decision the right one? From a medical standpoint, the answer seems clear. If he had allowed the amputation in 1978, he almost certainly would have lived. He might still be alive today, at 80 years old. He could have seen his grandchildren grow up. He could have made more music. But Bob didn't see it that way. For him, keeping his body whole was more important than prolonging his life. His faith was more important than his fear. Was it heroism? Was it stubbornness? Was it faith? Perhaps it was all three. Bob Marley left behind 11 children with 7 different women. His relationship with Rita was complicated. In Jamaican culture of that era, it wasn't uncommon for men to have children with multiple partners. Rita remained his wife and partner, but Bob had relationships with other women throughout his life. Among his children, Ziggy Marley became a successful reggae artist, winning 8 Grammy Awards. Stephen Marley became a renowned producer and artist. Damian Marley, born to 1976, Miss World Cindy Breakspear, collaborated with hip-hop artists and brought reggae to new audiences. Cedella Marley manages much of the family's business interests. Each child has honored their father's legacy in their own way. Today, the Marley family oversees a business empire worth more than $130 million. To understand Bob Marley's impact, we need to put him in historical context. In the 1960s and 70s, popular music was dominated by American and British artists. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Elvis Presley, Led Zeppelin. These were the names that sold millions of records. Music from the developing world rarely reached international audiences. Bob Marley changed that. He proved that an artist from a small Caribbean island could speak to the whole world. His music transcended language, race, and geography. But more than that, his music carried messages that resonated during a turbulent time. In the 1970s, America was recovering from Vietnam and Watergate. Britain was experiencing economic troubles. The world seemed uncertain, divided. Bob sang about unity, about love, about resistance against oppression, about hope. Let me give you specific examples. Get Up, Stand Up became an anthem for human rights movements around the world. When it was released in 1973, apartheid still ruled South Africa. Dictatorships controlled much of Latin America, and civil rights battles continued in America. Redemption Song, released in 1980, was Bob's most personal and perhaps most powerful song. With just his voice and acoustic guitar, he sang about emancipation from mental slavery, about freeing our minds. One Love, which became his most recognized song, was actually recorded twice, once in 1965 and again in 1977. The later version became a global anthem, still played at weddings, graduations, and celebrations worldwide. Today, Bob Marley's home at 56 Hope Road in Kingston is a museum. If you ever visit Jamaica, I encourage you to go. Walking through those rooms, seeing his guitars, his awards, his personal belongings, you get a sense of the man behind the music. 9 Mile, where he's buried, has become a pilgrimage site. Thousands visit each year from all over the world to pay respects at his mausoleum. In 2024, a new biographical film about Bob Marley was released. Bob Marley, One Love. It introduced his story to a new generation, grossing nearly $180 million worldwide. This says something important. Bob Marley's story still resonates. Young people today, who weren't even born when he died, are discovering his music and his message. But for those of you who lived through the 1970s, Bob Marley meant something specific to your generation. He was the voice saying that love could overcome hate, that unity was possible despite our differences, that we should stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. In an era of disco and punk rock, of economic uncertainty and political cynicism, Bob Marley offered something different. Hope rooted in spirituality, resistance rooted in love. Let me take a moment to explain why Jamaica, this small island nation, produced such influential music. Jamaica gained independence from Britain in 1962. It's a country of just under 3 million people, yet its cultural impact far exceeds its size. Reggae music emerged from a unique blend, African rhythms brought by enslaved people, combined with American R&B and jazz that arrived via radio waves, mixed with Caribbean musical traditions. But more than the sound, reggae carried messages of resistance, of pride in African heritage, of spiritual seeking. Bob Marley became the international face of this movement. But he stood on the shoulders of earlier Jamaican musicians who pioneered the sound. If we compare Bob Marley to other musical legends of his era, Elvis Presley, who died in 1977, brought rock and roll to the mainstream, but stayed largely within American culture. The Beatles broke up in 1970, and by 1980, John Lennon had been killed, effectively ending that chapter. Bob Marley, in his tragically short career from 1973 to 1980, managed to introduce an entirely new genre to the world and carry messages of social justice that still resonate today. What can we learn from Bob Marley's story? First, that conviction matters. Bob lived according to his beliefs, even when those beliefs cost him dearly in our modern world, where principles often bend to convenience. There's something admirable, if also tragic, in his unwavering faith. Second, that music truly is a universal language. Bob sang in English with a thick Jamaican accent about issues specific to his island, rooted in a faith most of his listeners didn't share. Yet millions around the world understood and embraced his message. Third, that talent combined with dedication can overcome almost any obstacle. Bob rose from poverty in one of Kingston's toughest neighborhoods to become a global icon. He did it through persistence, through belief in his art, through refusing to compromise his vision. If you were young in the 1970s, Bob Marley's music might have been the soundtrack to important moments in your life. Perhaps No Woman, No Cry played at a gathering of friends. Perhaps you heard Redemption Song and felt its message speak to your own struggles. Music has a way of marking time, of embedding itself in our memories. When we hear those songs now, we don't just hear music. We remember who we were, where we were, what we felt. That's the true measure of an artist's impact, not just commercial success, but the ability to become part of people's lives, part of their stories. Bob Marley died 44 years ago, but his music hasn't faded. If anything, each new generation discovers it anew. His decision to refuse amputation, the decision that ultimately cost him his life, remains controversial. Some see it as foolish, a preventable tragedy. Others see it as the ultimate expression of faith, of remaining true to oneself no matter the cost. Perhaps there's no single right answer. Perhaps both perspectives hold truth. What we can say with certainty is this: Bob Marley lived according to his principles. He used his platform to speak about love, justice, unity, and resistance. And through his music, he touched millions of lives. His final words, "Money can't buy life," resonate especially today in our material world, where we are constantly told that having more will make us happier. Bob, who had achieved wealth and fame, understood something deeper, that life's value isn't measured in possessions or achievements, but in how we live, what we believe, and what we leave behind. So the next time you hear "One Love" or "Three Little Birds," take a moment to remember the man who created that music. Remember the boy from 9 Mile who became a voice for millions. Remember the artist who chose faith over fear. Bob Marley's body rests in Jamaica, but his spirit, his message, lives on in every person who stands up for justice, who chooses love over hate, who refuses to let their mind be enslaved. As he sang, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." That message from 1980 remains as relevant today as it was then. Thank you for joining us for this documentary on Bob Marley. We hope it's given you a deeper understanding of the man behind the music, the faith behind the decisions, and the legacy that endures. If you knew someone who loved Bob Marley's music, please share this video with them. And if you'd like to see more documentaries about the legends of music history, please subscribe to our channel. Until next time, remember, one love.